The great council chamber floated in the void between stars, a massive station where representatives from hundreds of worlds gathered to maintain peace. Today that peace was crumbling. Ambassador Varric stood at the center platform, his crystalline body glowing with worry as he addressed the assembled delegates. The news he carried was worse than anyone had imagined. The Krell Dominion had violated every treaty, every agreement, every promise of peace they had ever made. Their fleet swept across the outer sectors like a plague, consuming world after world. Varric's hands trembled as he activated the holographic display. The images showed devastation on a scale the galaxy hadn't seen in thousands of years. Cities reduced to ash, populations scattered or worse. Military fleets that tried to stand against the Krell were simply erased from existence. Commander Lisa of the Etherian Defense Force stepped forward. Her blue skin looked pale under the chamber lights. She had commanded the defense of 3 systems before being forced to retreat. Her voice was steady, but everyone could hear the exhaustion beneath it. The Krell possessed weapons that shouldn't exist. Their molecular disruptors could tear apart ships atom by atom. Their phase technology let them pass through shields like they weren't even there. The delegates murmured among themselves. Fear rippled through the chamber. The Krell had been a minor power just 10 cycles ago. Something had changed. They had discovered ancient technology, weapons left behind by a race that had vanished millions of years before. Now they wielded power that no one could match. Representative Thelen of the Corvian Assembly demanded answers. How could this happen? Where were the defense fleets? Why hadn't the Council acted sooner? Varric had no good answers. The Krell had moved faster than anyone thought possible. By the time the Council realized the threat, it was already too late. 67 worlds had fallen. Billions of lives lost or displaced. The debate went in circles for hours. Some wanted to negotiate. Others demanded a military response. But everyone knew the truth. The combined military forces of the Council had already tried to stop the Krell. They had failed. 3 major fleets had been destroyed in the past month alone. The Krell were winning, and nothing seemed able to slow them down. Then Varric spoke the words that made the chamber fall silent. There was one option left. One species that might have the strength to face the Krell. But it was a desperate choice, possibly more dangerous than the threat they already faced. The humans. Most delegates had never heard of them. Those who had immediately objected. The humans were quarantined for good reason. They came from a planet on the edge of known space, a world so hostile that it had been classified as a Class 12 death world, the highest possible danger rating. Nothing that deadly should have evolved intelligent life. But somehow the humans had not just survived, but thrived. Varric explained what the Council's scientists had learned during first contact, nearly a century ago. The humans had evolved on a planet that was actively trying to kill them. Their world had crushing gravity, deadly weather, poisonous plants, and predators that made the Krell look gentle. The oceans were filled with creatures that could swallow ships. The land had beasts with claws and teeth designed for tearing flesh. Even the microscopic life was dangerous, constantly attacking the humans' bodies. But the humans had adapted in ways that seemed impossible. Their bodies were built for survival in conditions that would kill almost any other species. They had redundant organs, so losing one didn't mean death. Their bones were dense and strong, designed to carry them through high gravity. Their healing factor was legendary. A wound that would cripple most species for life would heal on a human in weeks. They could function with injuries that should have killed them, running on nothing but determination and something they called adrenaline. The first contact had been a disaster. The humans had sent a diplomatic ship to meet the Council's representatives. Everything had gone well until a minor accident caused a small fire. The Council delegates had panicked and evacuated. The humans had barely noticed. They walked through flames that should have burned them, breathing smoke that should have choked them, and calmly put out the fire. Then they asked if everyone was all right. 3 different species had refused to ever meet with humans again. The Council had decided that beings this dangerous should remain isolated until they could be properly studied. The humans had agreed, surprisingly. They said they understood and would wait until the galaxy was ready for them. That had been 98 cycles ago. Now Varric was proposing they break that quarantine. He was asking the Council to invite the Deathworlders in, to turn them loose on the Krell. It was a gamble. The humans might save them from the Krell, or they might prove to be an even greater threat. Commander Lisa supported the idea. She had studied the limited information available about human history. They had spent thousands of years fighting each other, developing weapons and tactics that made galactic warfare look primitive. They understood violence in ways that most species couldn't imagine, but they had also eventually united, formed a single planetary government, and reached for the stars. They were capable of peace, but they were very, very good at war. The debate resumed with new intensity. Some delegates argued that bringing in the humans was madness. Others said that madness was their only option. The Krell would reach the core worlds within a month at their current pace. Once they controlled the central sectors, the war would be over. The Council would fall and the Krell would rule the galaxy. Finally, after hours of argument, the vote was called. It passed by the narrowest margin. Varric was authorized to contact the humans and request their aid. He returned to his private chamber and composed the message carefully. It needed to convey the desperate situation without seeming weak. It needed to ask for help without demanding it. The humans had no obligation to help them. They had been isolated and ignored for nearly a century. He transmitted the message toward the Sol system, toward the small yellow star where the humans had built their civilization. The message traveled through the communication network, bouncing from relay to relay until it finally reached the edge of human space. Then Varric waited. The Council expected it would take weeks to get a response, if they got one at all. 3 days later, the answer came. It was short, direct, and written in perfect galactic standard. The translation was flawless. The message read simply, "We're coming." "Hold the line." Varric stared at those words for a long moment. The humans were coming. The Deathworlders were coming. He had gotten what he asked for. Now he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late to change course. The message had been sent. The invitation had been accepted. Soon the galaxy would meet humanity, and everything would change. The alarms blared across every monitoring station in the Zenthari home system. Something massive was approaching. The sensor operators scrambled to identify the incoming signatures. They expected Krell warships, another wave of attackers coming to finish what they had started. What they got instead was something completely different. Space itself seemed to tear open at the edge of the system. Flashes of light erupted in the darkness as ships dropped out of hyperspace. One after another they appeared. Dozens, then hundreds of vessels materialized from nothing. The Zenthari had never seen a fleet this large move as one coordinated unit. The precision was incredible. Each ship appeared in exactly the right position, already moving in formation. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the battleship Liberty and allowed himself a small smile. The jump had been perfect. His crew knew their jobs and they did them well. Behind him, 300 ships of the United Defense Force had just announced their presence to the galaxy. He could imagine the panic on the sensor stations as they tried to count all the new arrivals. Lieutenant Amy Collins worked at her station, pulling up tactical data and feeding it to the main display. The situation was clear and not good. The Krell had the planet surrounded. 200 warships formed a blockade that was slowly tightening. On the surface, cities were burning. The Zenthari defense forces were scattered and desperate. They had maybe days before the Krell started landing ground troops. Jake studied the enemy formation. The Krell ships were huge, each one larger than anything Earth had ever built. Their hulls were covered in weapons and their shields glowed with power. Standard military doctrine from any of the galactic powers would say this was an unwinnable fight. The humans were outnumbered and outgunned. They should retreat, regroup, find another way. But humans didn't follow standard doctrine. They had learned warfare on a planet where everything was trying to kill them. They had fought each other for thousands of years before finally figuring out peace. They knew things about combat that the galaxy had forgotten or never learned. Jake gave the order. All ships full speed ahead, straight at the enemy fleet. The crew responded without hesitation. They had trained for this. Every person on every ship knew exactly what to do. The human fleet accelerated toward the Krell blockade at speeds that made the watching Zenthari gasp in disbelief. Those velocities should have torn the ships apart. The forces involved should have turned the crews into paste against the back walls. Parvik, the Zenthari liaison assigned to the Liberty, grabbed onto a railing as the ship surged forward. He tried to understand what he was seeing. The humans had no defensive formations. They weren't angling their shields or preparing evasive maneuvers. They were just charging straight ahead like they had no fear of death. He wondered if maybe they didn't. The Krell noticed the approaching fleet and adjusted their formation. Their ships turned to face the new threat. Weapons powered up. Targeting systems locked on. The Krell had fought hundreds of battles and won them all. They saw the humans charging and prepared to add another victory to their record. The first salvo of Krell weapons fire lit up the darkness. Molecular disruptors, the same weapons that had torn apart every fleet that faced them, lanced across space. Beams of destructive energy that could take apart matter at the atomic level struck the human ships. Parvik closed his eyes, expecting to see the human fleet dissolve into clouds of atoms. Nothing happened. The weapons hit and dispersed. The human ships kept coming, their hulls showing no damage at all. Parvik stared in disbelief. He asked how this was possible. Those weapons had destroyed everything they touched. Engineer Danny Wright answered without looking up from his station. The explanation was simple. Human ships were built different. They used metals compressed under the crushing pressure of Earth's oceans, materials forged in conditions that would collapse any other structure. The molecular disruptors couldn't get a grip on bonds that tight. The weapons were useless. The Krell fired again. Same result. Their most powerful weapons couldn't scratch the human ships. Panic started to spread through the Krell fleet. They had never faced an enemy that could simply ignore their attacks. Then the humans opened fire. Their weapons were different. Not energy beams or exotic particles. They used kinetic rounds, solid metal slugs accelerated to incredible speeds. It was primitive technology, the kind of thing most advanced races had abandoned thousands of years ago. The galaxy had moved on to more elegant solutions. But primitive didn't mean ineffective. The rounds hammered into Krell ships with devastating force. Shields that could deflect energy weapons did nothing against solid matter, moving at a fraction of light speed. Armor designed to resist disruptors crumpled under kinetic impact. The Krell ships started taking damage, real damage, for the first time in their campaign. Jake watched the battle unfold and adjusted tactics in real time. He saw where the Krell were weak and directed his ships to exploit it. The human fleet moved like a living thing, each part supporting the others, adapting to every change in the enemy formation. This was what humans did best. They fought smart, they fought dirty, and they never stopped adapting. Commander Lisa Hayes led her boarding teams in. Her ship, the destroyer Valiant, matched course with a Krell cruiser and locked on. Cutting torches burned through the hull. Marines poured through the breach wearing armor that made them look like walking tanks. The Krell defenders had never faced boarding actions before. Galactic warfare was civilized, fought at range with clean weapons. The humans didn't fight clean. They fought to win. Lisa led her team through the corridors, their weapons firing the same kinetic rounds their ships used. Bullets tore through Krell armor. Explosives breached doorways. The Marines moved with practiced efficiency, clearing room after room, deck after deck. The Krell tried to fight back, but they weren't prepared for combat this close and personal. On another Krell ship, Sergeant Kevin Palmer used breaching charges to open a path to the reactor room. His team moved fast, placing charges on critical systems. They didn't try to capture the ship. They just needed it out of the fight. The charges detonated and the reactor went critical. The team evacuated seconds before the ship tore itself apart from the inside. The battle raged for 6 hours. To the watching Xanthari, it felt like 6 minutes. The humans moved so fast, fought so hard, adapted so quickly. Every time the Krell tried a new tactic, the humans had a counter within minutes. Every time a human ship took damage, 2 more moved in to cover it. Slowly, inevitably, the Krell fleet started to break. Ships exploded or went dead in space. Others tried to retreat, but the humans were faster. They chased down the fleeing vessels and disabled them. A few Krell ships managed to jump away to hyperspace, but most didn't get the chance. When the guns finally fell silent, the Krell blockade was gone. Over half their ships were destroyed. The rest had fled or surrendered. The Xanthari homeworld was safe, and the humans hadn't lost a single vessel. Jake stood on the bridge and looked at the tactical display. The battle was over. They had won. But this was just the beginning. The Krell wouldn't stop because of one defeat. This war was going to get worse before it got better. Parvik stared at the aftermath in shock. He had watched recordings of battles, had studied military tactics, had thought he understood warfare. Now he realized he understood nothing. The humans fought like nothing he had ever seen. They were fast, brutal, efficient, and absolutely terrifying. Jake noticed the liaison's expression and felt a twinge of sympathy. He remembered the first time he had seen real combat, back during the colony rebellions. It changed a person, made them see the universe differently. He walked over and put a hand on Parvik's shoulder. The captain's voice was gentle when he spoke. He told Parvik that war was ugly, always had been, always would be. But sometimes it was necessary. Sometimes you had to fight to protect what mattered. The humans didn't enjoy this. They just happened to be very, very good at it. Parvik looked at the human captain and asked the question that was burning in his mind. He asked how they could be so calm, so controlled after fighting like that. Jake smiled sadly. He said it was because they came from Earth. Their whole planet had trained them for survival. This was just another day, another fight. Another chance to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The humans had arrived and the galaxy would never be the same. The war spread across a dozen sectors. After their defeat at Zenthar Prime, the Krell pulled back to regroup. But the humans didn't give them time to recover. General Richard Blake commanded operations from the mobile command ship Defiance. He had learned long ago that the best way to win a war was to never let your enemy catch their breath. Keep them moving, keep them guessing, keep them afraid. Captain Nicole Stevens worked alongside the general, coordinating strikes across multiple systems at once. The scale of operations would have overwhelmed most military commanders. Managing fleets across light years of space, timing attacks to the second, ensuring supply lines stayed open. It was like conducting an orchestra, except every instrument was trying to kill you. The humans brought a completely different approach to warfare than the galaxy had ever seen. The other species fought carefully, methodically. They planned operations for months, moved slowly, tried to minimize losses. It was sensible, logical, safe. The humans looked at those tactics and threw them out the window. Jake Morrison, now promoted to Commodore, led a strike force that hit 3 Krell supply depots in a single day. His ships jumped in, destroyed their targets, and jumped out before the enemy could respond. The Krell scrambled to defend their supply lines, pulling ships away from their front lines. Exactly what the humans wanted. While the Krell were distracted, Lisa Hayes led another force that punched through their weakened defenses and struck at a shipyard. The Krell lost 6 months of ship production in 6 hours. The humans were everywhere at once, hitting targets the Krell didn't even know were vulnerable. It was chaos, and the humans thrived in chaos. The Krell tried to adapt. They reinforced their fortress world of Krellnax, a planet surrounded by defensive stations that had never been breached in 1,000 years. Layer after layer of shields, weapons platforms, and defense fleets. The Krell High Command retreated there, confident they were safe. Standard galactic siege warfare said it would take years to crack those defenses. The humans needed 3 weeks. Dr. Angela Cruz, a xenobiologist attached to the fleet, had been studying the Krell since the war began. She discovered something interesting. The Krell communicated through bioelectric pulses, a network that connected every member of their species. It made them incredibly coordinated but also created a weakness. Disrupt that network and they would be blind, confused, unable to work together. She brought her findings to the military engineers. They looked at her research and immediately saw the potential. Give them 5 days, they said. 5 days and they would have a weapon. Dr. Cruz thought they were joking. They weren't. The device they created was simple. A broadcast emitter that flooded the electromagnetic spectrum with noise tuned specifically to disrupt Krell bioelectric communication. It wouldn't hurt them, wouldn't kill them, just scramble their ability to coordinate. The engineers called it the jammer. Dr. Cruz called it brilliant. The attack on Krellnax began with the jammer. Every human ship activated their emitter simultaneously. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Krell defensive network, so carefully coordinated, fell apart. Ships drifted out of position. Weapons fired at nothing. Communication broke down. The impenetrable fortress suddenly looked vulnerable. The human fleet struck hard, not with fancy tactics or clever maneuvers. They just applied overwhelming force to weak points. Kinetic rounds hammered shields until they collapsed. Missiles found gaps in the defenses. Boarding teams cut through to critical systems. The orbital stations fell one by one. Then came the ground assault. Sergeant Kevin Palmer and the 5th Marine Raiders dropped from orbit in pods that slammed into the planet's surface, hard enough to leave craters. Most species would need to land gently, carefully, safely. Humans just reinforced their pods and rode them down like meteors. Kevin hit the ground running. Literally. His armor absorbed the impact that should have shattered every bone in his body. He and his team moved out before the dust settled, covering ground at speeds that seemed impossible for people in heavy armor. The Krell defenders had prepared for a conventional assault. They weren't ready for this. The Marines used tactics that baffled the Krell. They moved fast, struck hard, and never stopped. When they encountered a fortified position, they didn't try to slowly wear it down. They used explosives to breach walls, threw grenades around corners, called in airstrikes on hardened bunkers. Subtlety wasn't in the human vocabulary. What really confused the Krell was how humans dealt with casualties. When a Marine got hit, the others would drag them to cover, apply emergency medical treatment, and keep fighting. The wounded would often get back up and rejoin the battle. The Krell couldn't understand it. These injuries should have been incapacitating. How were the humans still fighting? The answer was simple. Humans were built to survive damage. Their redundant organs meant they could function with catastrophic injuries. Their pain tolerance was absurdly high. Their determination was even higher. A human Marine with a sucking chest wound would patch it, take some stimulants, and get back in the fight. It wasn't bravery. It was just what they did. Kevin's team fought their way to the planetary shield generator. The installation was buried deep underground, protected by meters of reinforced concrete and Krell defenders. The Marines used shaped charges to blast through the concrete. They fought room to room, corridor to corridor. When they ran low on ammunition, they switched to backup weapons. When those ran out, they fought hand to hand. The Krell had natural weapons, claws, and armored skin designed for combat. The humans had training, technique, and pure aggression. It wasn't even close. Kevin personally disabled the shield generator while his team held off the counterattack. The planetary shields came down and the orbital bombardment began. Admiral Karen Foster commanded the fleet action that destroyed the Krell shipyards. Her tactical approach made the galactic observers watching from their safe ships shake their heads in confusion. She divided her forces, something no sane commander would do. She used civilian mining ships as decoys, risking non-combatants. She even broadcast something called music on all frequencies. The music was particularly disturbing to the Krell. Humans called it death metal, which was an accurate description. Screaming vocals, pounding drums, guitars that sounded like weapons. The Krell communication network, already damaged by the jammers, couldn't filter it out. The sound drove them to distraction. While the Krell were confused and scattered, Admiral Foster's divided forces struck from 3 directions at once. The shipyards never had a chance. By the time the Krell realized what was happening, their industrial capacity was burning. Decades of construction facilities gone in hours. Lieutenant Chris Bennett worked in intelligence, analyzing enemy communications and predicting their moves. He explained to the confused galactic representatives that this was how humans fought. They adapted, they innovated, they found weaknesses and exploited them without mercy. Every battle taught them something new. Every defeat made them stronger. The galaxy watched in awe and fear. The humans weren't just winning battles. They were rewriting the rules of warfare. They moved faster than anyone thought possible. They hit harder than anyone expected. They adapted quicker than anyone could counter. And they never ever gave up. The Krell tried everything. They adapted their tactics, reinforced their positions, changed their strategies. Nothing worked. For every adjustment they made, the humans had a counter. It was like fighting an enemy that could read their minds and predict their every move. What the Krell didn't understand was that humans had spent thousands of years fighting each other. Every trick, every tactic, every strategy had been tried, countered, and refined through countless wars. The humans had seen it all before. They knew what worked and what didn't. They had learned their lessons in blood on their own world. General Blake stood in the command center and watched the tactical display. The Krell were retreating on all fronts. Their territory was shrinking. Their fleets were scattered. The war wasn't over, but the tide had turned. The humans were winning, but victory came at a cost. Reports filtered in from medical bays across the fleet. Thousands of wounded, hundreds of dead, ships damaged or destroyed. The humans were tough, but they weren't invincible. They bled like anyone else. They died like anyone else. They just made sure the other side paid a higher price. Nicole Stevens compiled the casualty reports and felt the weight of every name on that list. These weren't just numbers. They were people. Sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, husbands and wives. They had volunteered to leave Earth and fight for species they had never met. They died far from home in the cold darkness between stars. The general saw the expression on her face and understood. He had seen that look before, felt that weight himself. War was necessary sometimes, but it was never glorious, never clean, never easy. The humans won their battles, but they paid for every victory, and they would keep paying until the war was over. The Nexus Gate connected 3 sectors of space through ancient jump points that no one fully understood. Control the gate, and you controlled trade, movement, and military deployment across a significant portion of the galaxy. The Krell knew this. They launched a massive counter-offensive to retake it. Colonel Frank Mitchell commanded the defense with a mixed force of human and allied ships. His orders were simple: hold the gate until reinforcements arrived. The tactical situation was less simple. He had 50 ships. The Krell brought 250. The math was bad. But Frank had learned long ago that math didn't always decide battles. The Krell came in waves, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. Frank's forces met them head-on, using the gate's gravity wells and spatial anomalies to their advantage. Ships fought at knife-fighting range, too close for most galactic forces to even consider. The humans excelled at close combat. For 3 days, the battle raged without pause. Crews worked triple shifts, surviving on stimulants and sheer determination. Ships took damage and kept fighting. When weapons failed, they used backup systems. When those failed, they rammed. The Krell kept coming and the humans kept holding. On the 3rd day, a Krell dreadnought broke through the defensive line and made for the gate itself. Frank's ship, the cruiser Resolute, was badly damaged and running on emergency power. He should have fallen back, saved his ship and crew for another day. Instead, he ordered full speed ahead and intercepted the dreadnought. The 2 ships traded fire at point-blank range. The Resolute was outgunned, outmassed, and falling apart. Frank didn't care. He held position, kept firing, and didn't move until reinforcements arrived and destroyed the dreadnought. The gate held. The Krell offensive failed. Frank's ship barely made it back to dock. But victories like that came with a price the humans hadn't fully shared with their galactic allies. Dr. Sophie Turner worked in the medical bay, treating an endless stream of wounded. The galaxy saw humans as unstoppable warriors who could shrug off anything. Sophie saw the reality behind that image. Private Henry Scott had fought for 16 hours with a shattered leg. His armor's medical systems had injected him with enough painkillers to kill most species, and splinted the break with internal bracing. He had kept fighting because stopping meant letting his squad down. Now he lay on a medical bed waiting for surgery to pin the bones back together. Sophie looked at his chart and shook her head. The damage was severe. Henry would recover. His enhanced healing would see to that, but he would be in rehabilitation for months. He would carry a limp for the rest of his life. And he was one of the lucky ones. Corporal Amanda Price had manually sealed a hull breach when the emergency systems failed. She held a metal plate in place for 20 minutes while others worked to properly repair the hole. The heat had burned through her gloves and seared her hands. The vacuum exposure had damaged her lungs. She survived only because humans could function in conditions that would kill anyone else. Amanda would heal too. Her lungs would recover, skin would regrow over the burns. But she would have scars, visible reminders of what she had sacrificed. And like Henry, she considered herself lucky to be alive. The dead didn't get to consider anything at all. Sophie had signed off on 43 death certificates in the past week. 43 people who had left Earth expecting to come home someday. They were buried in space, committed to the void. Their bodies sent into the stars they had fought to protect. The psychological cost weighed even heavier than the physical injuries. Chaplain Gregory Walsh spent his days talking to soldiers who had seen too much combat. Young men and women who flinched at loud noises, who had nightmares about battles, who struggled with what they had done to survive. Lieutenant Chris Bennett sat in Gregory's office, hands shaking as he held a cup of coffee he couldn't drink. Chris worked in intelligence, supposedly safe behind the lines, but he had watched the battles through remote feeds. He had called in strikes that killed thousands. He had made decisions that sent people to their deaths. The weight of those choices was crushing him. Gregory listened without judgment. He had heard similar stories dozens of times. The Deathworlders were tough, everyone said so. What they didn't see was that toughness came at a cost. Humans could endure terrible things, but that didn't mean those things didn't affect them. They just carried the burden and kept moving forward. Commander Patricia Holmes led a raid deep into Krell territory to rescue prisoners from a labor camp. Intelligence suggested the Krell were holding captured species there, using them for forced labor. What Patricia's team found was far worse than anyone had imagined. The Krell had been experimenting on the prisoners, trying to understand galactic biology, testing weapons, seeing what different species could survive. The holding pens were filled with beings who had been subjected to horrors that made even hardened Marines look away. Some prisoners were beyond saving, too damaged to survive even with the best medical care. Patricia ordered her team to evacuate everyone they could. The Marines moved through the camp, carrying prisoners who couldn't walk, supporting those who could barely stand. They found beings from a dozen different species, all of them broken in body or mind or both. The rescue operation took hours longer than planned because the team refused to leave anyone behind. When they finally reached the extraction point, Patricia did a head count. They had saved 83 prisoners. Intelligence had suggested there were over 200 in the camp. She asked the survivors what happened to the others. The answer made her blood run cold. The Krell had killed them when they saw the rescue ships coming. Just executed them rather than let them be saved. The incident changed something in the human forces. Word spread quickly through the fleet. The Krell weren't just an enemy to be defeated. They were monsters who needed to be stopped permanently. The war took on a darker tone. Mercy became harder to find. Prisoners were still taken. Laws of war were still followed, but the humans fought with a new intensity. Captain Nathan Hughes addressed his crew after hearing about the camp. His voice was steady, but everyone could hear the anger beneath it. He told them they were fighting to ensure the Krell could never do this again. Not to this generation, not to the next, not to anyone. They would finish this war completely. General Blake received the reports from the labor camp and felt sick. He had seen war before, knew what people were capable of when they abandoned civilization. But this was systematic, calculated cruelty. The Krell had built facilities for this purpose. They had planned it, organized it, made it part of their strategy. He called a meeting with his senior commanders. They needed to discuss the endgame. The Krell homeworld would have to be taken. There was no other way to ensure this didn't happen again. But assaulting a species' homeworld was a massive undertaking. The casualties would be horrific. The cost would be measured in thousands of lives. Admiral Karen Foster argued they had no choice. The Krell had shown what they were capable of. Leaving them with any military capacity was too dangerous. They needed to be defeated completely, their war machine dismantled, their leadership held accountable. It was the only way to guarantee peace. Nicole Stevens pulled up casualty projections for an assault on the Krell homeworld. The numbers were brutal. Even with overwhelming force, even with every advantage, the humans would lose thousands, maybe tens of thousands. The Krell would fight hardest when defending their own world. It would be the bloodiest battle of the war, but the decision had already been made. The humans couldn't stop now, couldn't leave the job half done. They had come too far, lost too many people. The war would be finished, whatever the cost. The final push was coming, and everyone knew it would be hell. Jake Morrison visited the medical bay before his next deployment. He walked between the beds talking to wounded Marines, thanking them for their service. They all said the same thing. They would be back as soon as they healed. They wanted to finish the fight. Jake saw their determination and felt a mix of pride and sadness. These were good people, brave people, people who deserved better than to die in a war far from home. But they had volunteered for this. They had known the risks. They were doing what humans had always done throughout their history. They were standing up to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, regardless of the cost. The question was how much more they would have to pay before the war finally ended. The fleet assembled at the edge of Krell space, the largest military force humanity had ever gathered in one place. Over 500 ships from Earth's United Defense Force, plus another 200 vessels from allied species who had finally found the courage to join the fight. The target was the Krell homeworld itself, the heart of their empire. General Richard Blake stood aboard the Defiance and looked at the assembled fleet on his displays. So many ships, so many lives depending on the decisions he would make in the coming days. The assault plan was sound as any plan could be when attacking a heavily defended planet. But he knew that plans rarely survived contact with the enemy. The Krell homeworld was protected by every defense they could muster. Orbital platforms bristled with weapons. Minefields filled the approaches. Defense fleets patrolled in overlapping patterns, and on the surface, billions of Krell waited, ready to defend their home with everything they had. This would be the hardest battle of the war. Admiral Karen Foster commanded the first wave, a mixed force of human and allied ships that would punch through the outer defenses. Her ships jumped in system and immediately came under fire. The Krell had been waiting for this, had prepared for months. The defenders fought with desperate fury. Karen's tactical display lit up with threats. Missiles, energy weapons, kinetic rounds, everything the Krell could throw at them. Her ships took hits and returned fire. The battle became a brutal slugging match, ships trading blows at ranges where every shot counted. Some of her vessels took critical damage and had to fall back. Others pushed forward, grinding through the defenses meter by meter. Colonel Brandon Shaw prepared his ground forces for the assault. The 3rd Marine Division would lead the landing, targeting key positions across 3 continents. Brandon had fought in a dozen battles during this war, but this one felt different. This was the end, one way or another. Either they would break the Krell here or the war would drag on for years. The orbital bombardment began once the defense platforms were cleared. Human ships hammered military targets from space, trying to soften up the defenses before the Marines went in. Cities were avoided, civilian areas left untouched. The humans fought hard, but they still had rules, still had limits they wouldn't cross. The first landing pods hit the atmosphere like meteors. Inside, Brandon and his Marines braced for impact. The pods were designed to survive this, but that didn't make the ride any less terrifying. Everything shook, metal screamed, and then they hit the ground hard enough to rattle teeth. Brandon's pod door blew open and he charged out into hell. The Krell had fortified every possible landing zone. Defensive positions ringed the drop sites. Heavy weapons opened fire immediately. Marines died before they even made it out of their pods. Others made it a few steps further before going down. But most made it to cover and started returning fire. The battle for the surface began in earnest. Human forces pushed out from their landing zones, fighting for every meter of ground. The Krell defended their home with fanatical determination. They knew this was the end. If they lost here, they lost everything. So they fought with a desperation that made them even more dangerous. Sergeant Kevin Palmer led his squad through the ruins of what had been a Krell military installation. Automated defenses still operated, targeting anything that moved. His team used explosives to clear bunkers, grenades to flush out defenders, raw firepower to overwhelm positions. It was brutal work, exhausting and bloody. Kevin took a hit from a Krell defender's weapon, a blast that melted through his armor and burned into his shoulder. He dropped to one knee but kept firing. A Marine named Pete dragged him to cover while the others provided covering fire. The medic, a woman named Sarah, patched the wound with emergency foam and injected him with enough painkillers to drop a horse. Kevin tried to wave her off, saying he was fine. Sarah told him to shut up and let her work. When she finished, she helped him to his feet. He tested his arm, found he could still use it despite the pain, and nodded his thanks. Then he picked up his weapon and moved back to the fight. Sarah shook her head but followed. This was what humans did. They got hurt, they patched themselves up, and they kept going. The battle raged for weeks. Not days, weeks. The Krell didn't surrender, didn't retreat, didn't give up. Every building had to be cleared. Every strongpoint had to be taken. The Marines fought street by street, room by room in brutal close-quarters combat that favored neither side. Commander Patricia Holmes led an assault on a heavily fortified Krell command center. Intelligence said the planetary leadership was directing the defense from there. Taking it out would collapse their coordination, maybe break their will to fight. Patricia's force included both human Marines and soldiers from 3 allied species who had proven themselves in earlier battles. The command center was buried deep, underground, protected by layers of concrete, steel, and Krell defenders. Patricia's team fought their way down level by level. The fighting was intense. Close quarters, limited visibility, enemies around every corner. Her force took casualties but kept pushing forward. They reached the command level and encountered the heaviest resistance yet. Krell elite guards, the best troops they had, defended the final approaches. Patricia's team used everything they had: breaching charges, grenades, suppressing fire, coordinated assaults. Slowly, they pushed through. Brandon Shaw's forces converged on the same location from a different direction. His Marines linked up with Patricia's team, and together they made the final push. The Krell commanders tried to fight their way out, but there was nowhere to go. The facility was surrounded. The defense collapsed. In orbit, Admiral Foster received the signal that the command center had fallen. She ordered all forces to broadcast surrender terms. The message went out on every frequency and every language. The war was over. The Krell had lost. Further fighting would only cause more deaths. It was time to stop. For a moment, nothing happened. The battle continued as if the message hadn't been sent. Then, slowly, Krell forces started standing down. First a few units, then more, then entire defensive sectors. Not everyone surrendered immediately. Some diehards fought on for days. But the organized defense crumbled. Colonel Brandon Shaw stood in the ruins of what had been a Krell military district and watched Krell soldiers laying down their weapons. He felt exhausted, wrung out, empty. The battle was over. They had won. But looking at the devastation around him, at the bodies of both sides scattered across the ground, the victory felt hollow. General Blake received the final casualty reports and felt each number like a physical blow. 8,000 humans dead. 23,000 wounded. Hundreds of ships damaged or destroyed. The Allied forces had lost even more. And the Krell casualties were in the hundreds of thousands. So much death, so much destruction, all because one species had decided conquest was better than peace. Jake Morrison walked through the streets of the Krell capital city. The fighting here had been particularly intense. Buildings were collapsed or burning. The infrastructure was shattered. Krell civilians huddled in whatever shelter they could find, looking at the human soldiers with fear and uncertainty. Jake saw a group of young Krell, barely adults, watching his squad pass. They looked terrified. He stopped and approached slowly, hands visible and empty. Through a translator, he told them the fighting was over. They wouldn't be harmed. Humanitarian aid was coming. His people would help rebuild. The young Krell didn't respond, just stared. One of his Marines, a woman named Betty, pulled out a ration pack and offered it to them. Food was scarce after weeks of fighting. The young Krell hesitated, then one took the offered meal. Betty smiled and handed out more rations to the group. Small gestures, but they mattered. Dr. Angela Cruz landed with the first humanitarian mission. Her job was to assess the medical situation and coordinate relief efforts. What she found was worse than expected. The Krell medical system had collapsed. Disease was spreading. Thousands needed treatment they couldn't get. Angela immediately called for more medical teams. Within days, human field hospitals were treating Krell patients alongside their own wounded. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock, saving lives without asking which side anyone had fought for. The war was over. Now came the harder work of building peace. The Galactic Council convened to discuss what came next. The Krell had been defeated, but what should be done with them? Some species wanted punishment, wanted to see the Krell broken completely. Others argued for mercy, for helping them rebuild. The debate was fierce. Ambassador Varick, who had first contacted humanity, watched the proceedings with interest. The humans had done what they promised. They had stopped the Krell. But now the EIE Galaxy watched to see what the Deathworlders would do with their victory. Would they be conquerors? Tyrants? Or something else? General Blake addressed the council and gave them Earth's position. The Krell military would be dismantled. Their leadership would face justice for their crimes. But the Krell people would be helped to rebuild a peaceful society. Earth had learned from its own history. Crushing a defeated enemy completely only planted the seeds for future wars. Better to help them rise again as friends rather than enemies. The council debated for weeks before finally voting to accept the human proposal. The Krell Empire was dissolved. 6 months after the fall of the Krell homeworld, the Galactic Council convened for what everyone knew would be a historic session. The Great Chamber was filled to capacity. Representatives from hundreds of worlds had come to witness this moment. The question on everyone's mind was simple. What role would humanity play in the galaxy's future? Ambassador Varric stood at the podium and formally proposed that humanity be granted a seat on the council. His voice was steady, but everyone could hear the nervousness beneath. This was not a simple vote. This was the galaxy deciding whether to welcome the Deathworlders into their political structure or keep them at arm's length. The debate began immediately. Representative Theln of the Corvian Assembly stood to voice his concerns. He acknowledged that humanity had saved them from the Krell. No one disputed that. But he asked the question many were thinking. Had they simply traded one threat for another? The humans had demonstrated military power beyond anything the galaxy had seen. What would stop them from using that power to conquer rather than protect? Commander Lysa of the Etherian Defense Force spoke next. She had fought alongside the humans, had seen them up close during the darkest days of the war. She told the council that yes, humans were dangerous. Yes, they were capable of terrible violence, but they were also capable of great compassion. She had watched human medics treat enemy wounded. She had seen human engineers help rebuild destroyed worlds. The humans had choices, and they consistently chose to help rather than harm. The debate continued for hours. Some delegates spoke of their fear. They had seen the battle recordings, watched humans fight with an intensity that seemed inhuman. Others spoke of their gratitude. Their worlds would have fallen to the Krell if not for human intervention. The council was divided, and the vote would be close. General Richard Blake sat in the observers section listening to the debate. Part of him was frustrated. Humanity had done everything asked of them and more. They had bled for species they had never met. They had lost thousands of their own people protecting a galaxy that had quarantined them for nearly a century. And now that same galaxy debated whether to trust them. But another part of him understood. Earth's own history was full of well-meaning powers that became tyrants. The galaxy had every right to be cautious. Trust had to be earned, and humanity was still earning it. Captain Jake Morrison had retired from active military service to take on a new role. If the vote passed, he would be Earth's first official ambassador to the Galactic Council. He had spent the past months traveling to different worlds, meeting with various species, trying to build relationships and ease concerns. It was harder than fighting a war in some ways. On one world, he met with survivors of the Krell occupation. They thanked him for humanity's help but admitted they were afraid. The humans had been so effective at violence. What happened when they decided to use that capability for themselves? Jake had no easy answer. He could only promise that humanity valued peace that they had learned from their own violent past, that they chose to be protectors rather than conquerors. Dr. Angela Cruz worked in the reconstruction zones, helping restore the Krell homeworld. The work was difficult and often dangerous. Not all Krell accepted the occupation peacefully. There were still resistance groups, still attacks on aid workers. But Angela kept working, kept trying to heal rather than harm. She treated a young Krell who had been injured in a construction accident. The patient was terrified of her at first, had heard stories about the fearsome humans. But Angela was gentle, patient, professional. She fixed the injuries and explained everything she was doing. By the end, the young Krell was asking questions about Earth, curious about the planet that had produced such contradictory beings. Lieutenant Amy Collins trained local defense forces on several worlds, teaching them to protect themselves without relying on human military power. The students were eager to learn but often struggled with human tactics. She had to adapt her teaching, find ways to translate human approaches into methods that worked for species with different capabilities. One student, a Zenthari named Korich, asked her how humans could be so aggressive in combat. Amy thought about it before answering. She explained that aggression wasn't about anger or hatred. It was about commitment. When you decided something needed to be done, you did it with everything you had. Hold nothing back. Give your all. That was the human way. Back at the council, the debate reached its conclusion. It was time to vote. The chamber fell silent as the results were tallied. The measure passed, but barely. Humanity would receive a seat on the Galactic Council, but with conditions. They would share their military technology slowly, under strict oversight. They would respect galactic law. They would prove through their actions that they could be trusted partners. Ambassador Jake Morrison stood before the council to give his acceptance speech. He chose his words carefully. He acknowledged the galaxy's concerns and validated them. He admitted that humanity was dangerous and always would be, but he emphasized that they chose to use that danger in service of peace. He spoke of Earth's own history, the wars and violence that had nearly destroyed them, and how they had learned to channel their aggressive nature into protection rather than conquest. He proposed something new, the Sentinel Initiative, a joint defense force that would combine human military doctrine with galactic technology and personnel, not an army of occupation or conquest, but a true defensive alliance. Every species would contribute. Every species would benefit. And every species would have a voice in how it operated. The Council received the proposal with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a way to keep humanity's military power in check. Others saw it as giving the humans too much influence. But most recognized it as a genuine attempt at cooperation. A committee was formed to study the proposal and develop recommendations. Admiral Karen Foster took on the task of creating the Sentinel Initiative. She worked with military commanders from a dozen species, trying to blend different approaches into something cohesive. It was like solving a puzzle where none of the pieces quite fit together. But slowly, through compromise and creativity, a framework emerged. The initiative would have mixed crews, with no species making up more than 40% of any unit. Command positions would rotate among species to prevent any one group from dominating. Training would combine the best practices from everyone. Humans would teach aggressive tactics and adaptability. Others would teach patience and precision. Everyone would learn from each other. Commander Patricia Holmes commanded one of the first Sentinel ships, a destroyer with a crew representing 8 different species. The early days were chaotic. Different species had different needs, different communication styles, different approaches to everything, but they worked through it, learned to understand each other, found common ground. One day they responded to a distress call from a civilian transport under attack by pirates. The mixed crew worked together seamlessly, each species contributing their strengths. The humans provided aggressive combat tactics. The Zenthari offered precise targeting. The Etherians coordinated communications. They saved the transport and captured the pirates without losing anyone. It was proof the concept could work. 5 years after the war ended, the galaxy looked very different. Trade routes that had been closed for decades reopened. Research projects combined human innovation with alien knowledge, producing breakthroughs no single species could achieve alone. The Sentinel Initiative had grown into a respected force that kept the peace without threatening anyone. The Krell had been integrated into galactic society, though the process was still ongoing. Their military was gone, dismantled piece by piece. But their people were rebuilding, creating a new culture based on cooperation rather than conquest. It would take generations to fully heal, but progress was being made. Sergeant Kevin Palmer, now a civilian, worked as a construction supervisor on a Krell world. He led mixed teams of humans and Krell, building schools and hospitals. Some of his Krell workers had fought against him during the war. Now they worked beside him, building a future together. It was strange, sometimes uncomfortable, but it was also hopeful. Dr. Sophie Turner opened a medical school that trained doctors from across the galaxy. Human medicine combined with alien techniques produced better healthcare for everyone. Her students learned to treat species they had never encountered before, to adapt procedures for different biologies, to see patients as people regardless of what they looked like. Lieutenant Chris Bennett left the military and became a historian. He wrote the definitive account of the war, interviewing veterans from all sides, collecting stories and perspectives. His book became required reading at military academies across the galaxy. The final chapter was titled The Deathworlder's Choice, and it examined how humanity decided to become protectors rather than conquerors. He wrote that everything had changed with the arrival of the Deathworlder fleet. The humans came from a world designed to kill them, fighting wars that should have broken them, facing odds that should have defeated them. They did the impossible because their planet had taught them that impossible was just another challenge to overcome. And in doing so, they didn't just save the galaxy from the Krell. They showed everyone what could be.